Have you ever had one of those days where nothing seems to go right? The forecast called for clear skies overnight, but you wake up to a foot and a half of fresh powder in your drive. And so you go to the garage to fire up the snowblower, right? And the engine turns over and over and over, and it doesn't make sense because the thing worked just a couple of days ago. And so now you're scratching your head, okay, what to do? And you say, I think I can make it out. And so you gun it, right? Through the drive, just blast through the snow. And you make it. And you get out and you make it to work, and you get your cup of coffee going, and you try and get your head straight because you're still flustered from the morning, still annoyed, right? But you got stuff to get accomplished. So you grab that cup of coffee and you put it to your mouth, and the first thing you do is you miss. And hot, dark liquid is streaming down your white shirt. You ever had a day like that? Do you ever feel like you have a life like that? Sometimes our lives can feel overshadowed by all that goes wrong in them, right? Like sometimes it just feels like things are doomed to fail. There's actually a psychological concept, a reality for us as humankind that tells us this. It's called the negativity bias. I don't know if you've heard of that. What it means is we are actually, our natural state in this world is to experience and respond and think on and remember the negative over and above the positive. Right? So this is the reason why insults, for instance, if you've been insulted, that memory will stick longer with you than the compliment you received. It's the reason why traumatic episodes from a person's life will last longer or will influence a person's character more than even a really positive experience from their life. It's the reason why John Gottman, one of the celebrated psychologists of our time, says that in a relationship, in order to have a good, healthy relationship, you need 5 positive interactions in that relationship for every 1 negative interaction. It's his magic number, he says. 5 to 1 because of this negativity bias. And so I think it's no wonder, right, that life can feel overshadowed. Even for someone who has a relatively good life, or for whom things are relatively stable, you still can have a looming sense of the darkness around us. Well, in our text today, we heard about Mary. We heard about the overshadowing that was to come upon her life. And I think it's instructive for us to look at Mary as a kind of case example of what to do with that reality when life is shadowed. Our story today in our text, it took place in the 6th month, it said. Now, Luke means the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, right? The relative of Mary. Remember how we heard last week how that angel had come and visited Zechariah in the temple, telling him of a birth to come to that old barren couple, Zechariah and Elizabeth. The birth of John the Baptist. Well, Luke has lined up his gospel, so to speak, to tell the stories of John and Jesus sort of paralleled all throughout chapter 1, even all the way into chapter 4, I think it is. We hear from John and Jesus and John and Jesus. And so here comes the angel Gabriel again in our text today with another birth announcement. But the parallels take a sharp turn here. Right? If those Jewish ears would have perked up at the mention of a barren couple in the beginning of Luke's gospel, oh, what's God up to here? Will it happen again? If they were perked up because of the familiarity of that story, those same Jewish ears would be perked up because of the novelty of this section of text. The angel Gabriel came to a virgin. A virgin? What is God up to here? What's he doing with this virgin? This is unusual. The text said the angel came to her and said, "Greetings, O favored one. The Lord is with you." But she, Mary, was greatly troubled at the saying. That's a strange response to this kind of message, don't you think? To be greatly troubled at what essentially is a message of hope, a message of grace, actually. In the Greek text, in just 2 sentences from the angel, we get 3 episodes of grace, okay? The Greek word is charis. That means grace. So the angel shows up and says, "Greetings." And in the Greek text, it's the word chaire, connected to charis, which is more than just hi. It's more than just hello. It's be happy, rejoice, be glad. I'm coming with a message of positivity, of encouragement, of hope. Greetings. Greetings, highly favored one, charito in the text, again connected to charis. To be the noun charito, that means you're the recipient of some good thing, a blessing. So the angel has come with this message of goodness, and you are the recipient, Mary. And by the way, you have found favor with God. And there we get the actual word charis in the text. You have found grace with God. God's heart is warmed to you. His position towards you is one of affection, of love. He means you good. And yet Mary is greatly troubled at this. Why would that be? It seems that maybe Mary has a negativity bias of her own. How else to explain being so disconcerted at such a message of glorious grace? How do we understand that? How do we explain that? Well, maybe Mary's life was filled with the same sorts of struggling and strife, of disappointment and dissatisfaction as we experience. Maybe Mary, being from that small town of Nazareth, maybe she had experienced some form of rejection or condescension in her life. Maybe she had been on the receiving end of insults, right? Well, what good can come out of Nazareth anyway? Maybe Mary, being a woman living in first century Palestine, maybe she had witnessed the kind of danger and oppression that existed for women like her. And maybe she was concerned for her own life if she didn't end up in the arms of a good, righteous man. Whatever the case may be, something gave Mary pause when she received what was essentially a glorious greeting. And don't you and I respond similarly at times to the good things that happen in your life and mine? I mean, when something's going well, or you have hopeful expectations, don't we often knock on wood? Why do we feel the need to follow up things that are positive with sort of this wishy-washy, maybe something bad's going to come right after it sense? Why do we feel the need to maybe undercut ourselves, right? Tell a self-deprecating joke after something has gone really well for us instead of just rejoicing in the positivity? Maybe life has biased us in one direction. I wonder, don't we have the same difficulty when it comes to engaging in our faith? Even here in this place, when we hear that same message of grace, isn't it at times difficult to come here to this place and hear God's great announcement of grace and love for you in your life? When you walk out of this place and experience what feels like a contradiction to that in your average workaday, real-world existence? Can it be difficult to join into the songs and hymns of praise with shouts of wonder and love towards God for His presence in your life, when it can feel difficult to even have a sense of his presence. Maybe because of whatever calamity you're experiencing, or maybe because of the recognition of some sinful pattern in your life that leads you to wonder, would God really want me? Does he really want me as I am, not as I wish I could be or would be? Do we find ourselves, too, at the mention of grace, greatly troubled by the saying, trying to discern what it might mean for us? Well, we ought not imagine that our life with God, his presence or promises in our life, we should not imagine that that means we will only experience sunshine in this life. I mean, God's presence is about to supernaturally fill the life of Mary in a way that we can't even comprehend, maybe even in a way that we have a hard time actually believing. A virgin becoming pregnant. And yet, how does the angel put this good news? The power of the Most High will overshadow you. What a strange way to talk about the presence of God in your life. Overshadowed. There's a poet named Lucy Shaw, and she gets at that particular phrase in a poem of hers called The Overshadow. I'll read it for you. She writes, "When we think of God and angels and the angel, we suppose ineffable light. So there's surprise in the air when we see him bring to Mary in her lit room a gift of darkness. What is happening under that huge wing of shade? In that mystery, what inbreaking wildness fills her? She is astonished and afraid. Even in that secret twilight, she bends her head, hiding her face behind the curtain of her hair. She knows that the rest of her life will mirror this blaze, this sudden midnight. A gift of darkness. That would certainly be true in Mary's life, even in the days and weeks to come. Right? People in a small town can add things up. Right? Even if she can get Joseph to be convinced of this astonishingly absurd, upside-down reality, she's still going to be subject to the murmurs and the whispers of the townsfolk when they realize and recognize that the child that she is to conceive and bear will be born before he ought to be, before she's married. She knows she'll be seen as the mother of an illegitimate child. She knows how vulnerable that will make her. The presence of Jesus in her life will mean uncertainty, not only in how she's going to be received and recognized by her fellow townspeople, but uncertainty even as Jesus' ministry grows and thrives. Right? Jesus will have a target on his back. Jesus will be subject to a smear campaign. We don't hear about it in the Gospel of Luke, but in Matthew chapter 12 and in Mark chapter 3, there's a story where Jesus heals a demon-possessed man. And the religious leaders of the time, they say, "Ha, you can only do this because you yourself are demon-possessed." It's the claim they'll make against Jesus. And if you read in the context, you'll notice Jesus' family, they come out to him and they kind of try and usher him inside. Right? The crowd and the disciples say, "Hey, Jesus, your mom and your siblings, they want to talk to you." And Jesus, he won't be protected. He won't go to the shelter of his family's home to retreat from this attack, but instead he will lean directly into it. Jesus' family's intentions to help shelter and protect Jesus will fail because he will continue to live into who he is, even in the face of danger. It'll bring uncertainty to the life of his family. Uncertainty for his mom, right? Who sees her baby out there, right? They're always your babies. It'll also bring vulnerability to Mary. Certainly for Mary in her birth out of wedlock, but also with the divine plan looming over Jesus' life. Remember Simeon's words to the family just after Jesus is born. Right? He says to her, Jesus is going to be responsible for the rising and falling of many in Israel, and a sword will pierce your own soul also. A gift of darkness. And yet in the face of all of this, Mary, young Mary, surrenders. Let it be to me according to your word. And Mary's no fool. She's not gullible. She knows what she's getting into. She's thoughtful, but at that point, Mary takes her hands off of her life. You know, Mary knows that something's up when the angel Gabriel says, "You shall call his name Jesus." Because when you're the parent, right, you get to call the shots. You set the rules, you make the plans, and the kids just have to follow along, right? The kids are accountable to you, and they dream of the day, at least my daughter dreams of the day, when she gets to make the rules. I can't wait to grow up so I can make the rules. She says, you get to say how everything goes. Like, no, not exactly, but kids dream of that, but that's not the case, right? As parents, we have the authority, but not for Mary. Right? As parents, we get to name the child, but not for Mary, because when you come into the presence of Jesus, he's the authority. Jesus calls the shots. Jesus tells us how we are to live. Jesus directs us by his word, and that's not to be argued with or contended with. Right? As followers of Jesus, we don't say, well, that's a nice suggestion. No, we say, you are Lord. And when we do that, you can be certain that a shadow or two will fall upon your life as well. Now, you might be the subject of a smear campaign. Right? As Christians, as little Christs, you too have a target on your back. Satan wants nothing more than to rip you away, pull you away from your faith and your life with God. Being a follower of Jesus will bring uncertainty and vulnerability in your life too. But you can do it. You can also take your hands off your life. If Mary can do it, so too can you and me. But I'll tell you right now, she's better than you and me. Because Mary did this. She took the hands off of her life before she knew what Jesus would do for her. Before she realized that Jesus was going to do infinitely more for her than she was going to do for him. See, while Mary was overshadowed by God's power, you and I have seen the shadow of God. That term, overshadowed, it's used 5 times in the New Testament. Once here, and 3 times to describe the transfiguration of Jesus. Right? When the disciples went up on the mountain, and the glory of God overshadowed them. The glory of God, that's the shadow that we are privileged to see and to know. The glory of Christ's resurrection after his death, after the cross. The glory that the disciples saw on the top of that mountain that was so powerful, they said, hey, let's stick around here for a while. This is good. We don't want to go back down the mountain into that life, into that strife, into that struggle and difficulty. Can we just stay here, Jesus? Of course, Jesus led them down the mountain. There was work to do. But they saw the glory. They glimpsed the glory, and you and I have too. We know that Jesus historically, objectively, died on the cross, and not only that, rose again from the dead, historically, objectively, and personally. For you, he did that. And yet we still experience the shadow in our lives. But But for you and me, the shadow is always the shadow of the cross. Right? The shadow of the cross. Yes, there are still challenges and difficulties that you and I face. Jesus told us there would be. He didn't set up our expectations any other way, right? He calls us to follow him down the mountain like his disciples. But as with all shadows, there's a light source behind them. It's that candle of peace. It's the second candle, the second week of Advent. It's the theme week of peace. That candle that was lit by the rising of the sun, Jesus Christ, which gives us ultimate peace. Which means that the shade and the shadows that you and I experience, they're not actually evidences of God's absence, but they're proof of his presence. God's shadow as he stretches over us, doing great things, absurd things, things that we would never ask him to do in our lives. And yet he is working for a purpose. And so if following Christ means there'll be trouble in our lives, let's face it with hopeful grit. Let's face it with thoughtful surrender, like Mary. Mary, who when she took her hands off her life, yes, it did mean vulnerability, right? She knew it meant embarrassment and maybe even being ostracized by those around her. It meant uncertainty and vulnerability. But Jesus, when he took his hands off his life, it meant descending from heaven to earth. It meant leaving the glory of God the Father willingly to come down off of that mountain into this, the real, workaday, tangible, real world. It meant torture and death. Jesus became vulnerable, right? Remember the Garden of Gethsemane. He knew what was to come, and he prayed, I don't want to go through with this. But what did he say? Father, I am your servant. Let it be to me according to your word. He did that for us. That's where you get the power to do it for him. And Mary didn't even know that. But look at what she did. Oh, let us not fall lower in the test than this 15-year-old, unwed, uneducated girl. Take your hands off your life. Surrender to him. Give yourself to him completely. For he is your light behind all of the shadows. In Jesus' name, amen. I invite you to rise as we continue our worship service.